The stagecoach rattled into Fort Laramie, Wyoming on a blistering July afternoon in 1873, and Katelyn Owens pressed her handkerchief against her forehead, wondering if she had made the worst mistake of her life leaving Boston for this desolate frontier town. She had traveled 2,000 miles to become the new schoolteacher, answering an advertisement that promised adventure and purpose. But as she stepped down onto the dusty street, all she felt was a profound sense of isolation. The buildings were rough wooden structures that looked like they might blow away in a strong wind, and the few people she saw moving about had the hardened, weathered look of those who had survived too many harsh winters and blistering summers. The man who caught her attention immediately was not trying to be noticed at all. He stood near the general store, tall and broad-shouldered, with muscles that strained against his worn buckskin shirt, his dark hair falling past his collar in waves that suggested he cut it himself with a hunting knife when it got too long. His face was all hard angles and sun-darkened skin, and when his eyes met hers for just a moment, she felt something shift in her chest, though she could not have explained why. He looked away quickly, as if the brief connection had startled him, and disappeared around the corner before she could even nod a greeting. "That would be Tobias Yates," said a woman's voice behind her. Katelyn turned to find a round-faced woman in her 40s, smiling warmly despite the oppressive heat. "I am Martha Henderson. My husband runs the boarding house where you will be staying. Do not mind Tobias. He comes down from the mountains maybe 4 times a year, trades his furs, buys supplies, and heads right back up. He's been living up there alone for near 30 years, since he was just a young man. Some say he went up after a broken heart, but nobody knows for sure. He does not talk much." Katelyn felt an unexpected pang of sadness for the mountain man who lived alone in the wilderness. 30 years? That's a very long time to be by oneself. "Some men prefer it that way," Martha said, gesturing toward a wagon. "Come along, dear. Let us get you settled. You must be exhausted from your journey." The boarding house was simple but clean, and Martha showed Katelyn to a small room on the second floor with a window that looked out over the main street. After washing the dust from her face and changing into a fresh dress, Katelyn went downstairs to join Martha and her husband George for supper. They told her about the town, about the children she would be teaching when school started in September, about the dangers of rattlesnakes and the occasional conflicts with displaced native tribes who rightfully resented the encroachment on their lands. "The school building needs some repairs before you can start," George said, passing her a bowl of stewed vegetables. "The roof leaks something fierce, and the door does not hang right anymore. We have been trying to find someone willing to do the work, but most of the men around here are busy with their own homesteads and ranches." "What about Tobias Yates?" Martha asked her husband. "He is in town, and he is better with his hands than anyone I know. Remember when he fixed our barn door that time? It has not given us a moment of trouble since." George shook his head. "Tobias does not do work for hire, you know that. He lives up there to avoid people, not to help them." But Martha had a determined look in her eyes. "It does not hurt to ask. The worst he can say is no." The next morning, Katelyn walked to the small schoolhouse at the edge of town with Martha. The building was indeed in poor condition, with gaps in the roof where rain would pour through and a door that hung at an awkward angle on broken hinges. Inside, the desks were dusty but serviceable, and someone had left a few worn books on a shelf in the corner. Katelyn felt a surge of determination. She had not come all this way to be defeated by a leaky roof. "I'm going to talk to Tobias," Martha announced. "He is camped by the creek just north of town. Will you come with me?" Katelyn hesitated, remembering those intense eyes and the way her heart had stuttered when their gazes met. "Perhaps it would be better if you went alone. He does not know me." "Nonsense. You are the school teacher. He should hear from you why this matters." They found Tobias Yates by the creek, as Martha had predicted. He had set up a simple camp with a canvas lean-to and a small fire. He was skinning a rabbit when they approached, his large hands moving with practiced efficiency, and he looked up at their arrival with an expression that was not quite welcoming but not hostile either. Up close, Katelyn could see the details that distance had hidden: the small scar above his left eyebrow, the depth of the lines around his eyes from squinting at mountain sunlight, the sheer size of him. He had to be well over 6 feet tall, and his arms were corded with muscle from a lifetime of hard physical labor. Mr. Yates, Martha began cheerfully, this is Miss Katelyn Owens, our new school teacher. We have a favor to ask. Tobias stood slowly, wiping his hands on his trousers. When he spoke, his voice was deeper than Katelyn had expected, rough from disuse. I'm not much for favors. The schoolhouse needs repairs before the children can return in September, Katelyn said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. The roof leaks, and the door's broken. We would pay you for your time, of course. His dark eyes settled on her face, studying her with an intensity that made her feel exposed. I do not need money. Then perhaps you might do it for the children, she said softly. They deserve a proper place to learn. Something flickered across his features, too quick for her to identify. I'm heading back to the mountains tomorrow. The repairs would not take more than a day or two, Martha pressed. You are the best carpenter in these parts, Tobias. Everyone knows it. He looked away, his jaw working as if he were chewing on the decision. Finally, he gave a short nod. I will look at it this afternoon, but I make no promises. Relief flooded through Katelyn. Thank you, Mr. Yates, truly. He did not respond, just returned to his work with the rabbit, and Martha tugged gently on Katelyn's arm to lead her away. As they walked back toward town, Katelyn glanced over her shoulder once and found him watching her, an unreadable expression on his rugged face. True to his word, Tobias arrived at the schoolhouse that afternoon carrying a worn toolbox and a ladder he had borrowed from the livery. Katelyn was inside sweeping when she heard his boots on the porch, and she stepped outside to find him examining the damaged door with a critical eye. This whole frame needs to be replaced, he said without preamble. Wood has rotted through. I will need to get lumber from the mill. How long will it take? 3 days, maybe 4. I will need to make the repairs properly if they are going to last. He turned to look at her, and again she felt that strange flutter in her chest. You do not sound like you are from around here. Boston, she admitted. I came west to teach. Long way from home. This is my home now. She said it with more confidence than she felt. He nodded slowly, as if he understood something she had not said aloud, then climbed the ladder to examine the roof. Katelyn watched him work, fascinated by the easy way he moved despite his size, the careful precision with which he tested each board and shingle. He did not speak again until he climbed down an hour later. I can fix it, he said, but I will need supplies from town. I will start tomorrow morning. I will be here to help however I can. His eyes met hers, and for a moment she thought he might smile, but he just gave another of those short nods and walked away, his long stride carrying him quickly down the dusty road. Katelyn spent that evening at the boarding house writing a letter to her sister in Boston, describing the town and the people she had met. She found herself writing more about Tobias Yates than she intended, about the way he seemed to carry a deep loneliness, despite his preference for solitude, about the strength in his hands, and the gentleness she sensed beneath his rough exterior. She sealed the letter without rereading it, afraid she might scratch out those observations if she thought too hard about why she had included them. The next morning, Tobias arrived at the schoolhouse with a wagon full of lumber and tools. He set to work immediately, and Katelyn brought him water and tried to stay out of his way. By noon, he had removed the old doorframe and was measuring and cutting the new wood with smooth, efficient movements. She made sandwiches at the boarding house and brought them back wrapped in cloth. You should eat something, she said, setting the package on a nearby desk. He paused in his work, looking at the offered food and then at her face. Thank you. They ate in companionable silence, sitting on the schoolhouse steps. Katelyn searched for something to say that would not sound foolish or intrusive, but the quiet felt natural rather than awkward. It was Tobias who finally spoke. Why did you really leave Boston? The question surprised her. I told you, to teach. Could have taught in Boston, she sighed, deciding there was no point in being less than honest. My father wanted me to marry a man I did not love. A banker, very respectable, very boring. I wanted more from life than being some man's ornament, so when I saw the advertisement for a teacher out here, I answered it before I could talk myself out of it. Tobias was quiet for a long moment. That took courage. Or foolishness. I have not decided which yet. This time he did smile, just a small upturn at the corner of his mouth, but it transformed his whole face. Maybe both. Over the next 3 days, Katelyn found herself spending more and more time at the schoolhouse, ostensibly to clean and organize, but really to watch Tobias work and to talk with him during the brief breaks he allowed himself. He was not a man of many words, but when he did speak, it was always something worth hearing. He told her about the mountains where he lived, about the wildlife and the changing seasons, about the small cabin he had built with his own hands near a lake so clear you could see 20 feet down to the rocky bottom. "It sounds beautiful," she said wistfully. "I have never seen real mountains." "They are not for everyone," he said. "Harsh winters, long stretches where you do not see another soul for months, but there is a peace up there I have never found anywhere else." "You have been alone for 30 years? He did not answer right away, focusing intently on the shingle he was nailing into place. "About that, yes." "Do you not get lonely?" "Sometimes." He looked down at her from the roof, and there was something raw in his expression. "More lately than I used to." On the 4th day, Tobias finished the repairs. The door hung perfectly straight on new hinges that would not rust or break, and the roof was solid and watertight. He packed his tools carefully and loaded them into the wagon, and Katelyn felt an unexpected sadness that the work was done. She had grown accustomed to his presence, to the quiet comfort of having him nearby. "Thank you, Mr. Yates," she said formally. "The schoolhouse is perfect now." "Tobias," he said. "You can call me Tobias. Then you must call me Katelyn." He nodded, and they stood there in the late afternoon sunlight, neither seeming to know what to say next. Finally, Tobias cleared his throat. "I will be heading back to the mountains tomorrow morning. I have been in town too long as it is." "Will you come back in the fall?" "I usually come down around October, before the first heavy snow." "I hope I will see you then." Something shifted in his eyes, a softening that made him look younger somehow. "I reckon you will." That evening, the Hendersons held a small dinner to celebrate the completion of the schoolhouse repairs, inviting Katelyn and Tobias and a few other townspeople. Tobias looked uncomfortable in the crowded room, standing near the door as if ready to bolt at any moment, but when Katelyn entered, his posture relaxed slightly. She made her way through the room to his side. "You look like you would rather be facing a grizzly bear," she said quietly. "At least I know what to expect from a grizzly." She laughed, and he looked down at her with something that might have been fondness. They ate together, standing away from the main table, and Katelyn told him about her plans for the school year, about the subjects she wanted to teach and the books she hoped to acquire. He listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions about how she would manage students of so many different ages in one room. After the meal, someone produced a fiddle, and the furniture was pushed back to clear space for dancing. Katelyn had not expected Tobias to ask her, so she was startled when he appeared at her elbow and held out his large, calloused hand. "I'm not much for dancing," he said gruffly, "but I could manage one if you would like." Her heart hammered against her ribs. "I would like that very much." His hand was warm and rough when it closed around hers, and he placed his other hand carefully at her waist, holding her as if she were something fragile that might break. They moved awkwardly at first, Tobias clearly out of practice, but gradually they found a rhythm that worked. Katelyn was acutely aware of his size and strength, of the way his chest rose and fell with his breathing, of the scent of pine and leather that clung to him. "When did you last dance?" she asked softly. 31 years ago at my sister's wedding. She died the following winter, along with my parents, when a fever went through town. I went to the mountains not long after." "I am so sorry, Tobias." He looked down at her, and in his eyes she saw decades of grief and loneliness. "It was a long time ago." "That does not make it hurt less." The song ended, but they stood there for a moment longer, still holding each other. Then Tobias stepped back, dropping his hands to his sides, and the careful distance was back in his expression. "I should go," he said. "Early start tomorrow." "Of course." She tried to keep the disappointment from her voice. "Safe travels, Tobias." He hesitated, opened his mouth as if to say something, then just nodded and left. Katelyn watched him go, feeling as if something important had just slipped through her fingers. She did not sleep well that night, tossing in the narrow bed and thinking about the mountain man who would be gone in the morning. She had known him less than a week, but already his absence felt like a physical ache. It was foolish and irrational, this feeling that had grown so quickly, but she could not deny its existence. Just before dawn, unable to bear the thought of him leaving without a proper goodbye, Katelyn dressed quickly and hurried to the creek where he had camped. The sky was just beginning to lighten in the east, and morning mist hung low over the water. Tobias was loading the last of his supplies onto his horse, a sturdy roan mare that nickered softly at Katelyn's approach. Tobias turned, surprise evident on his face. "Katelyn, what are you doing here at this hour?" "I could not let you leave without saying goodbye." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling foolish for coming. "I wanted to thank you again for your help." "You already thanked me." "I know, but I meant to say more than just thank you. I meant to say that these past few days have been special to me, that I have enjoyed your company very much." The words tumbled out in a rush, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. Tobias went very still, his hands frozen on the leather straps he had been adjusting. When he looked at her, there was something fierce and vulnerable in his expression that took her breath away. "Katelyn," he said, and it was almost a question. She stepped closer, drawn by something she did not fully understand. He was so tall that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, and she could see the rapid pulse beating at the base of his throat. The moment stretched between them, taut with possibility. "I do not want you to go," she whispered. "I have to. I do not belong in towns with people. I would not know how to live any other way." "And if I said I would miss you terribly?" His jaw clenched, and she could see the war being waged behind his eyes. "Then I would say I am likely to miss you more." Without thinking, acting on pure instinct, Katelyn rose up on her toes and pressed her lips to his. For a heartbeat he was frozen, and she thought she had made a terrible mistake. Then his arms came around her, pulling her against his solid chest, and he kissed her back with a desperation that spoke of 30 years of loneliness and longing. His mouth was surprisingly gentle despite the intensity of his hold, and when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Katelyn felt as if the world had shifted on its axis. "I will write to you," he said hoarsely, "every day. I have not written a letter in 30 years, not since before my family died, but I will write to you every day if you want me to." Tears pricked at her eyes. "I want that more than anything. I will be back in October. I swear it. I will be waiting." He kissed her once more, quick and fierce, then forced himself to step back and mount his horse. Katelyn watched him ride away toward the mountains, her fingers pressed to her lips, and felt the strange certainty that her life would never be the same. The first letter arrived 6 days later, delivered by a trapper who was passing through Fort Laramie on his way east. Martha brought it to the schoolhouse, where Katelyn was washing windows in preparation for the start of the school year. "This came for you," Martha said, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. Katelyn wiped her hands on her apron and took the envelope, recognizing Tobias's bold, angular handwriting, even though she had never seen it before. Her heart raced as she broke the seal. "Dear Katelyn," the letter began, and she smiled at the formality. "I hope this letter finds you well. I made it back to my cabin yesterday evening. The ride up was lonely in a way it has never been before, because now I know what I am leaving behind in Fort Laramie. I keep thinking about that morning by the creek, about the way you looked with the dawn light in your hair. I keep thinking about that kiss, which has haunted me every mile of the journey." The letter went on for 2 pages, describing his cabin and the lake and the way the mountains looked in the summer sunset. His writing was straightforward and honest, with none of the flowery language she might have expected in a love letter. But it was perfect, because it was purely him. At the end, he wrote, "I'm not a man who knows how to speak pretty words, but I want you to know that meeting you has changed something in me. These mountains do not feel like enough anymore. I will write again tomorrow, as promised. Yours, Tobias." Katelyn pressed the letter to her chest, blinking back tears. Martha squeezed her shoulder gently. "He's a good man, that one. Lonely, but good." "He is," Katelyn agreed softly. True to his word, letters arrived with remarkable regularity. Tobias must have been riding down to leave them with trappers and traders heading to Fort Laramie, because Katelyn received at least 2 or 3 letters every week. Each one was a glimpse into his daily life, the work of maintaining his cabin, the animals he encountered, the books he read by lamplight in the long evenings. And in every letter, he wrote about how he thought of her constantly, how he counted the days until October when he could see her again. Katelyn wrote back just as frequently, telling him about the students who arrived in September, about the lessons she was teaching, about the challenges and small victories of her work. She told him things she had never told anyone, her fears and hopes, her memories of growing up in Boston, her dreams for the future. Writing to Tobias felt as natural as breathing, and she found herself pouring out her heart in ways that would have terrified her if she had stopped to think about it. School kept her busy as autumn arrived and the aspens turned gold on the hillsides. She had 15 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and they tested her patience and her creativity daily. But she loved the work, loved seeing their faces light up when they mastered a difficult concept, loved the way they gradually began to trust her. In her letters, she told Tobias about each child, and he responded with thoughtful observations and occasional advice that suggested a wisdom born of long solitude and reflection. As September turned to October, Katelyn found herself watching the road north with increasing frequency, hoping to see a lone rider on a roan mare. The leaves fell from the trees, and the air grew crisp with the promise of winter. And then, on a bright October afternoon when the students were practicing their penmanship, she looked up to see Tobias standing in the doorway of the schoolhouse, hat in hand, his dark eyes fixed on her face. Her heart leaped so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She dismissed the students early, earning curious looks and giggles, and the moment the last child was out the door, Tobias crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms. They kissed with the pent-up longing of 3 months apart, and Katelyn felt tears stream down her face even as she laughed with joy. "You came back," she said unnecessarily. "I said I would." His voice was rough with emotion. "Did you doubt it?" "Not for a moment." He cupped her face in his large hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "I read your letters 100 times each. They were the only thing that made the loneliness bearable. Yours too. I have them all saved in a box under my bed." They talked until the sun set, sitting close together on the schoolhouse steps, catching up on all the small details that letters could not fully convey. Tobias told her that he had spent much of the past 3 months thinking about his life, about whether he truly wanted to continue living in isolation or if there might be another way. "I am not saying I know what the answer is yet," he admitted, "but for the first time in 30 years, I'm questioning whether the mountains are enough, whether the peace I found up there is worth the cost of being without you." Katelyn took his hand, lacing her smaller fingers through his. "I would never ask you to give up something that is part of who you are. I know, but I'm asking myself if I'm ready for something more." He looked at her intently. "The truth is, Katelyn, I think I'm falling in love with you." "No, that's not right. I think I already have fallen in love with you. It happened that morning by the creek, maybe even before, and these months apart have only made it stronger." Her breath caught. "I love you too, Tobias. I've been so afraid to say it, afraid it was too soon or too foolish, but I do. I love you." They kissed again, and this time there was a sweetness mixed with the passion, a sense of coming home. When they finally broke apart, Tobias rested his forehead against hers. "I want to court you properly," he said. "I want to do this right. Will you let me?" "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, absolutely yes." Over the next 2 weeks, Tobias remained in Fort Laramie, and they spent every free moment together. He helped her at the schoolhouse after the students went home, repairing a loose floorboard and building new shelves for the growing collection of books. They took long walks in the crisp autumn air, talking about everything and nothing. He told her more about his past, about the grief that had driven him into the mountains and the slow healing that had come with time and solitude. She told him about the pressures she had felt in Boston, about the expectations that had suffocated her and the freedom she had found in the West. The townspeople watched their courtship with approval and amusement. Martha Henderson declared that she had known from the start that they were perfect for each other. George built a bench outside the boarding house where Tobias and Katelyn could sit together in the evenings, properly chaperoned but afforded some privacy by the gathering darkness. One evening, as they sat on that bench watching the stars emerge one by one, Tobias said quietly, "I need to go back to the mountains soon. Winter comes early up there, and I need to prepare my cabin and lay in supplies. But I will come back down in the spring, as soon as the passes are clear." Katelyn had been dreading this moment, but she nodded. "I understand. And I will keep writing, every single day, just like I have been. So will I." He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. When I come back in the spring, I want to ask you something important. I'm not asking now because I want to give you time to be sure, to know that this is what you really want. But I need you to know that my intentions are serious, Katelyn. I want a future with you." She knew what he was saying, what he was promising, and her heart soared, even as tears filled her eyes again. "I already know my answer, Tobias, but I will wait until spring to give it to you, if that is what you need." He kissed her tenderly. "Have I told you that you are the bravest woman I have ever met? You have now." Tobias left 2 days later, riding north into the mountains as the first snow began to fall. Katelyn watched until he disappeared from sight, then returned to her room and opened the box where she kept his letters. She read through them again, smiling at his words, and then took out a fresh sheet of paper to begin her letter for that day. Winter in Fort Laramie was harder than Katelyn had anticipated. The temperatures plunged below zero, and snow piled up in drifts higher than her head. The school closed for 2 weeks in January when it was simply too cold for the children to make the journey from their outlying farms and ranches. But through it all, the letters kept coming. Trappers and traders braved the brutal weather to bring them, and Katelyn's room slowly filled with Tobias's words. His letters from the winter months were different from those of the autumn. They were deeper, more introspective, as if the long dark months gave him time to examine his own heart in ways he had not before. He wrote about his childhood, about the dreams he had once held before tragedy struck. He wrote about the guilt he had carried for surviving when his family had not, and how that guilt had kept him isolated for so long. And he wrote about how loving her had begun to heal those old wounds, how the thought of a future with her made him believe in possibilities he had long since given up on. "I used to think the mountains were my home," he wrote in a letter that arrived in late February. "But I'm beginning to realize that home is not a place, it is a person. You are my home, Katelyn, no matter where I am." She cried when she read those words and immediately wrote back to tell him that she felt exactly the same way. She told him about the life she imagined for them, about the family they might have, and the years they would spend together. She told him that she would gladly live in his mountain cabin, if that was what he wanted, or in Fort Laramie if he preferred, or anywhere in the world as long as they were together. March brought the first hints of spring, and with it came news that made Katelyn's blood run cold. A trapper arrived in town with word that there had been a severe avalanche in the high country, destroying several cabins and killing at least 3 people. Tobias's name was not among the confirmed dead, but no one had seen him or heard from him since the avalanche. Katelyn spent the next 2 weeks in an agony of fear and uncertainty. No letters came, and she began to fear the worst. She tried to stay strong for her students, but Martha found her crying in the schoolhouse one afternoon after classes had ended. "He is strong, dear," Martha said, holding her close. "If anyone can survive up there, it is Tobias." "But what if something has happened to him? What if he is hurt or trapped or—" She could not finish the sentence. "Then we will find out soon enough, but I do not believe Tobias Yates is the type of man to leave you without saying goodbye. Not after everything he has written to you." Martha's faith proved justified. 3 days later, a letter arrived and Katelyn nearly collapsed with relief when she saw Tobias's handwriting. The letter was brief and to the point. "I'm alive and well. The avalanche hit 2 miles from my cabin, and I've been helping to dig out survivors and recover bodies. I could not get a letter out until now. I will be coming down as soon as the passes are clear, probably early April. I cannot wait to see you. All my love, Tobias." April arrived with mud and melting snow, and the first wildflowers pushing up through the wet earth. Katelyn's students were restless with spring fever, and she was equally distracted, watching the northern road every time she heard hoofbeats. And then, on a mild afternoon when the cottonwoods were just beginning to bud, she looked up from her lesson on arithmetic to see Tobias riding into town. She dismissed the students immediately and ran outside, not caring who saw her or what they thought. Tobias swung down from his horse and caught her in his arms, lifting her off her feet as he held her close. They stayed like that for a long moment, just holding each other, and Katelyn felt all the fear and worry of the past weeks drain away. "I was so scared," she said into his chest, "when I heard about the avalanche." "I am here," he murmured. "I am safe. I would not leave you, Katelyn, not ever." He set her down gently, and she saw that he looked different. There was a new lightness in his expression, a sense of peace that had not been there before. He took her hand and led her away from the curious eyes of the townspeople to a quiet spot by the creek where they had first kissed. "I have done a lot of thinking over the winter," he said without preamble, "about what I want from life, about what matters most. And I have come to realize that these mountains, as beautiful as they are just a place. They are not what makes me who I am. You do that, Katelyn. You make me want to be a better man, a man worthy of your love." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box, carved with intricate patterns of leaves and flowers. Inside was a simple gold ring. "I made this ring myself from gold I panned from the creek near my cabin," he said, and his voice shook slightly. "It is not fancy, but it is honest work, and it comes with all my heart. Katelyn Owens, will you marry me? Will you take a chance on a mountain man who has been alone too long, but who loves you more than he ever thought possible?" Tears streamed down her face as she nodded vigorously. "Yes. Yes, Tobias, I will marry you. I've been waiting to say yes since you left last fall." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made just for her. They kissed in the spring sunshine, and Katelyn felt as if her heart might burst with happiness. Everything she had hoped for, everything she had dreamed about during those long winter months, was coming true. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony in the church at Fort Laramie. The whole town turned out to witness the mountain man and the schoolteacher pledge their lives to one another. Katelyn wore a dress that Martha had helped her make from fabric ordered from back east, and Tobias wore a new suit that he had purchased for the occasion, though he looked slightly uncomfortable in the formal attire. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Tobias kissed her so thoroughly that several people in the audience laughed and applauded. The question of where they would live had been resolved in the weeks before the wedding. Katelyn would continue teaching in Fort Laramie during the school year, living in the small house that Tobias had purchased and quickly renovated at the edge of town. When summer came and school let out, they would go together to his cabin in the mountains, spending the warm months in the high country and returning to Fort Laramie in time for the fall semester. It was a compromise that satisfied them both, giving Tobias the solitude and connection to nature he craved while allowing Katelyn to continue her work with the children. Their first months of marriage were blissful. Tobias proved to be an attentive and devoted husband, bringing her wildflowers and cooking game he had hunted in the nearby hills. Katelyn discovered that he had a dry sense of humor that emerged once he felt comfortable, and his rare smiles became more frequent. The house they shared was small but cozy, and they spent the long spring evenings talking and reading together by the fire. When June arrived and the school year ended, they packed supplies and made the journey up into the mountains. The cabin Tobias had described in his letters was everything Katelyn had imagined and more. It sat in a clearing overlooking a pristine lake, surrounded by towering pines and snow-capped peaks. The cabin itself was solidly built from logs Tobias had cut himself, with a stone fireplace and large windows that let in abundant light. Inside, everything was neat and well-maintained, the home of a man who took pride in his work. "It is beautiful," Katelyn breathed, standing on the porch and looking out at the view. "I can see why you love it here." Tobias came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on top of her head. "It is even more beautiful now that you are here to share it with me." They fell into an easy rhythm during those summer months. Tobias taught Katelyn how to fish in the lake and how to identify edible plants in the forest. She taught him the poems she had memorized as a child and read aloud to him from the books they had brought. They swam in the icy lake on hot afternoons and made love in the cabin while rain drummed on the roof. It was a time of profound contentment, of two solitary souls finding completion in one another. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset behind the mountains, Katelyn said, "I never thanked you for the letters." Tobias looked at her quizzically. "I think you thanked me many times." "Not properly, not for what they really meant." She took his hand. "You had not written a letter in 30 years, but you wrote to me every single day after we kissed. Do you know what that meant to me? It was not just the words, though I treasured every one of them. It was the fact that you cared enough to break a 30-year pattern, to reach out across all those miles and share yourself with me." Those letters kept me going through the long winter. They gave me hope and joy when I was lonely and afraid." He was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "I had stopped believing that there was anyone in the world who would want to hear what I had to say. When you kissed me that morning, it was like waking up after a very long sleep. I realized that I had been hiding up here, not because I preferred solitude, but because I was afraid of being hurt again, afraid of losing someone else I loved. But you were worth the risk, Katelyn. You are worth everything." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat together as darkness fell and the stars came out, the kind of comfortable silence that only comes between two people who truly understand one another. In late August, they returned to Fort Laramie in time for the start of the school year. The students welcomed Katelyn back with enthusiasm, and several of them shyly greeted Tobias, who they had heard had become the teacher's husband. To everyone's surprise, Tobias began coming to the schoolhouse regularly, helping with repairs and occasionally assisting with lessons on practical skills like woodworking and animal tracking. The children adored him, and Katelyn felt her heart swell with love every time she saw her quiet, reserved husband patiently showing a young boy how to whittle or explaining to a curious girl the differences between bear tracks and wolf tracks. That autumn, Katelyn discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Tobias one evening after supper, watching his face carefully for his reaction. He went very still, and for a moment she worried that he was not pleased. Then he pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, and she felt his shoulders shake. "Tobias? Are you crying?" "I never thought I would have this," he said, his voice muffled. "A wife, a child, a family. I had accepted that I would die alone in those mountains. And now—" He pulled back to look at her, and his eyes were indeed wet with tears. "Now I have everything I never dared to hope for." Their son was born the following May, after a labor that lasted through the night and into the morning. Tobias refused to leave Katelyn's side, holding her hand and wiping her forehead with a cool cloth, his face pale with worry. When the baby finally arrived, healthy and squalling, the midwife placed him in Tobias's arms, and the big mountain man looked down at his son with an expression of pure wonder. "He is perfect," Tobias whispered. "Katelyn, he is perfect." They named him Thomas after Tobias's father, and from the moment of his birth, he had his father wrapped around his tiny finger. Tobias proved to be a devoted and gentle father, getting up in the night to walk with Thomas when he cried, building him a beautiful cradle from mountain pine, talking to him in a low, soothing voice, even though the baby was too young to understand the words. That summer, they took Thomas to the mountain cabin for the first time. Katelyn worried that the journey would be too difficult with an infant, but Tobias fashioned a clever carrier that allowed her to keep the baby close while they traveled. The cabin felt like home in a new way, now that Thomas was with them. And Katelyn loved watching Tobias teach their son about the mountains, pointing out eagles soaring overhead and explaining the different types of trees, even though Thomas was still too young to understand. The years that followed established a pattern that defined their life together. School year in Fort Laramie, summers in the mountains, their family growing as two more children arrived, a daughter named Catherine after Katelyn, and then another son they named Matthew. The little house in Fort Laramie had to be expanded to accommodate the growing family, and Tobias did the work himself, his skilled hands creating sturdy walls and comfortable spaces. Tobias never did completely lose his preference for quiet and solitude, but he learned to navigate the demands of family life with grace and humor. The children knew that their father was different from other men in town, that he was most comfortable in the wilderness, but they also knew with absolute certainty that he loved them fiercely and would do anything to keep them safe and happy. Every year on their wedding anniversary, Tobias gave Katelyn a letter not to be mailed, but to be read immediately. These anniversary letters became a cherished tradition, each one reflecting on the year that had passed and the love that continued to grow between them. Katelyn saved everyone, keeping them in a special wooden box that Tobias had made for her. As their children grew older, they took on more responsibilities both in town and in the mountains. Thomas, who was very much his father's son, loved the summers in the high country and showed an early aptitude for tracking and hunting. Catherine inherited her mother's love of books and learning, and she spent her mountain summers reading under the pines and writing in journals. Matthew, the baby of the family, was a curious and adventurous child who seemed to find joy everywhere he looked. The schoolhouse in Fort Laramie became a second home to the family. Katelyn continued teaching, and as her children grew old enough, they attended her classes. Tobias built additions and improvements over the years, and the building became a point of pride for the whole town. Students who had learned under Katelyn's instruction went on to become doctors, lawyers, teachers themselves, and they often wrote to thank her for the foundation she had given them. One autumn evening when Thomas was 12, Catherine 9, and Matthew 6, the family sat together at the dinner table in their Fort Laramie home. Thomas was talking excitedly about a deer he had tracked that afternoon with his father, and Catherine was describing a particularly difficult mathematics problem she had finally solved. Matthew was more interested in the cookies Martha Henderson had sent over that afternoon. Katelyn looked around the table at her family, at her strong, steady husband who still wrote her letters even though they slept side by side every night, at her bright, healthy children who were growing up too fast, and felt a wave of gratitude so intense it brought tears to her eyes. This was everything she had left Boston to find, everything she had hoped for when she stepped off that stagecoach 15 years ago. The Wild West had given her not just a home, but a life beyond her wildest dreams. "What is wrong, Mama?" Catherine asked, noticing her tears. "Nothing is wrong, sweetheart. I'm just very happy." Tobias reached across the table and took her hand, and the look he gave her held all the love and devotion of their years together. "So am I," he said quietly. That winter was particularly harsh, with temperatures that dropped so low that travel became nearly impossible. The school closed for a month, and the family was forced to stay close to home, venturing out only when necessary. But rather than feeling trapped, they made the most of the time together. Tobias taught the boys how to carve wood by the fireplace, creating small animals and useful tools. Katelyn worked with Catherine on her reading and writing, delighted by her daughter's quick mind and creative spirit. They played games in the evening, told stories, sang songs, and grew closer as a family. One night, after the children were asleep, Katelyn and Tobias sat together by the fire. Tobias was reading one of the books Katelyn had ordered from back east, and she was mending a tear in one of Matthew's shirts. The domestic comfort of the moment filled her with contentment. "Do you ever regret it?" Tobias asked suddenly, setting down his book. "Regret what?" "Leaving Boston, marrying a mountain man, living this life instead of the one you could have had back east." Katelyn set down her mending and moved to sit beside him, nestling against his solid warmth. "Not for a single moment. This life, this family, you are everything I ever wanted, even when I did not know it was what I wanted. Do you regret coming down from your mountains?" "I regret the 30 years I spent up there alone," he said honestly. "But I do not regret anything from the moment I first saw you step off that stagecoach. You gave me back my life, Katelyn. You gave me a reason to write letters again, a reason to care about more than just surviving. You gave me love and a family and a purpose. How could I possibly regret that?" They made love that night with the tenderness and passion that had only deepened over the years of their marriage. And afterward, as Tobias held her close, Katelyn thought about how many letters he had written her over the years, hundreds of them, maybe even thousands by now, each one a small piece of his heart, a connection maintained even when they were sleeping in the same bed. It was one of the things she loved most about him, that even after all these years, he still took the time to tell her in writing what she meant to him. Spring arrived eventually, as it always did, and with it came preparations for the journey back to the mountains. The children helped pack supplies, excited to return to the cabin by the lake. This year, Thomas would be old enough to help his father with some of the heavier work of maintaining the property, and he was eager to prove himself. The ride up into the mountains was as beautiful as Katelyn remembered, with wildflowers carpeting the meadows and snowmelt feeding rushing streams. When they finally arrived at the cabin, the whole family pitched in to open it up for the summer, sweeping out dust and airing out bedding and stocking the shelves with their supplies. That summer proved to be one of the best of Katelyn's life. The children were old enough now to be truly helpful, but still young enough to find wonder in everything around them. Thomas accompanied Tobias on fishing expeditions, learning the patience and skill required to catch the wary trout in the mountain streams. Catherine started a garden near the cabin, carefully tending her vegetables and herbs with a dedication that made Katelyn proud. Matthew explored everything with boundless enthusiasm, returning to the cabin each evening with pockets full of interesting rocks and questions about everything he had seen. One afternoon in July, Katelyn and Tobias took a rare moment alone together, leaving the children under Catherine's watchful eye while they walked to a favorite spot overlooking the lake. They sat on a large flat rock, holding hands and enjoying the peace. "I have been thinking," Tobias said slowly, "about maybe selling the house in Fort Laramie, moving up here permanently." Katelyn looked at him in surprise. "But what about my teaching? The children are getting older. Thomas will be ready to strike out on his own before we know it. Catherine could teach if she wanted to. She has learned everything you know, and then some. And Matthew, well, Matthew will probably end up traveling the world, knowing him." He smiled fondly. "I just thought maybe it was time to consider what we want for ourselves, not just for the children." Katelyn considered this carefully. She had loved teaching, had poured her heart into it for 15 years, but she also felt the pull of these mountains, the peace and beauty that Tobias had found here long ago. And the truth was, the children were getting older. Thomas would turn 13 soon, and it would not be long before he was grown. Perhaps it was time to think about the next chapter of their lives. "Let me think about it," she said finally. "I do not want to make this decision lightly, but I am not opposed to the idea." Over the course of that summer, Katelyn found herself paying closer attention to how she felt in the mountains versus in town. She realized that while she loved teaching, she loved being here with her family more. The mountains had worked their magic on her, just as they had on Tobias all those years ago. By the time they packed up to return to Fort Laramie in late August, she had made her decision. "Let us give it 2 more years," she told Tobias as they rode down from the high country. "I want to see Thomas through to his 15th year, and I want to train someone to take over the school. But then, yes, let us come up here and stay." The look of joy on Tobias's face made her certain she had made the right choice. Those next 2 years passed quickly. Katelyn found a young woman named Sarah Mitchell, who had recently arrived in Fort Laramie and was eager to teach. Katelyn spent months training Sarah, sharing lesson plans and teaching techniques, making sure the students would be in good hands. The townspeople were sad to lose their beloved teacher, but understood her decision, and they threw a grand party to celebrate her years of service. On their last day in Fort Laramie, Katelyn stood in the schoolhouse one final time, running her hand over the desk where she had spent so many hours, remembering the children she had taught and the lives she had hopefully touched. Tobias came to stand beside her, and together they looked around the room that held so many memories. "No regrets?" he asked. "No regrets," she confirmed. "I am ready for our next adventure." They sold the house to a young couple who were expecting their first child, and Katelyn felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that her home would continue to shelter a family. Then, with their children and their packed belongings, they made the journey up into the mountains one last time, this time to stay. Life in the high country was different from the rhythms of town life, but the family adapted quickly. Thomas grew into a strong young man under his father's tutelage, learning everything Tobias could teach him about surviving and thriving in the wilderness. Catherine discovered a talent for sketching and painting, capturing the beauty of the mountains in ways that took Katelyn's breath away. Matthew remained their adventurer, always pushing boundaries and exploring new territories, though he always came home in the end. Tobias and Katelyn settled into a comfortable routine, working together to maintain the cabin and the property, fishing and hunting and gardening to provide for their needs. They took long walks together in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing, still discovering new things about each other even after nearly 20 years of marriage. And every night before bed, Tobias wrote Katelyn a letter. Sometimes it was just a few lines, other times several pages, but he never failed to write. He described what he had observed that day, what he was feeling, how much he loved her. Katelyn treasured each one, and her collection of letters grew to fill several boxes. She often reread them when Tobias was out hunting or working, smiling at his words and marveling that this incredible man had chosen to spend his life with her. When Thomas turned 18, he announced that he wanted to try his hand at trapping, following in the footsteps of the men who had carried letters between his parents all those years ago. Tobias helped him prepare, teaching him the routes and the trade, introducing him to the other trappers and traders who worked the mountain territory. It was hard for Katelyn to watch her firstborn child leave, but she understood that he needed to find his own way in the world. Catherine, at 15, showed no interest in leaving. She was happy in the mountains, spending her days painting and reading and helping her mother with the household work. She had her father's love of solitude and her mother's intellectual curiosity, and she seemed perfectly content with the quiet life they led. Matthew, at 12, was torn between wanting to explore the world beyond the mountains and not wanting to leave his family. Katelyn assured him that he would have plenty of time to decide what he wanted to do with his life, and that whatever he chose, they would support him. One autumn day when the aspens were blazing gold and the air had the sharp clarity that comes before the first snow, Katelyn and Tobias celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary. Their children had planned a surprise for them, a picnic by the lake with all of their favorite foods, and a beautiful cake that Catherine had spent days decorating. After they ate, Thomas presented them with a gift he had made during his travels, a beautifully carved wooden box with an intricate scene of the mountains on the lid. "I thought you might need a bigger box for all of Papa's letters," Thomas said with a grin. Katelyn laughed, touched by her son's thoughtfulness. "You know about the letters?" "Mama, everyone knows about the letters," Catherine said. "Papa still writes you one every night, even though you are right there beside him. It is the most romantic thing I have ever heard." Tobias looked slightly embarrassed but pleased. "Your mother deserves to be told every day how much she is loved." After the children had cleaned up from the picnic and headed back to the cabin, giving their parents some privacy, Katelyn and Tobias sat by the lake watching the sunset behind the peaks. The years had been kind to them both. Tobias's hair was streaked with silver now, and there were lines around Katelyn's eyes, but they were still strong and healthy, still deeply in love. 20 years, Katelyn mused. It feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. "Best 20 years of my life," Tobias said firmly, "and I intend to give you at least 20 more." "At least," she agreed, leaning her head on his shoulder. He pulled an envelope from his pocket and handed it to her. "Your anniversary letter, I wrote it this morning." She opened it carefully, as she had done with every letter he had ever written her, and began to read. "My dearest Katelyn," it began. 20 years ago today, you took a chance on a lonely mountain man who had forgotten how to live. You gave me back my heart, my hope, my future. Every day since then has been a gift I never thought I would receive. You have given me children, a family, a home in the truest sense of the word. You have shown me that love is not something to be feared, but something to be embraced with both hands. I write you these letters, as I have every day since our first kiss, because there are not enough ways to tell you what you mean to me. But I will keep trying, for as many days as I have left. I love you, Katelyn. I will love you until my last breath and beyond. Yours always, Tobias." Tears streamed down her face as she carefully folded the letter and tucked it back into the envelope. "I do not know how I got so lucky," she whispered. "We both got lucky," he said, kissing her temple. "We found each other in this vast wilderness, against all odds. That is not luck that is meant to be." The years continued to roll by, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their children's lives. Thomas became a skilled trapper and guide, eventually settling down with a young woman he met in one of the frontier towns and starting a family of his own. Catherine married a surveyor who came through the mountains one summer, a quiet man who appreciated her artistic talent and her love of the wilderness. They built a cabin not far from Tobias and Katelyn's, and Catherine continued to paint, her work eventually gaining recognition when a traveling art dealer saw her paintings and insisted on showing them in galleries back east. Matthew, as predicted, became a wanderer. He explored territories from California to Canada, sending letters home with colorful descriptions of everything he saw. But he always came back to the mountains for visits, and Tobias and Katelyn treasured those times when all three of their children were home. As Katelyn and Tobias grew older, they slowed down but never stopped appreciating the life they had built together. Tobias's hair went completely silver, and his strong body finally began to show the effects of decades of hard work. Katelyn developed some stiffness in her joints, and she moved more carefully than she once had. But their love remained as strong as ever, a constant in the ever-changing landscape of their lives. Grandchildren arrived. Thomas had 3 boys. Catherine had twin girls, and Matthew eventually settled down and had a son and a daughter. The cabin that had once seemed so isolated became the gathering place for an extended family, and Tobias, who had spent 30 years alone, now found himself surrounded by the noise and chaos of children and grandchildren, and he loved every minute of it. On their 30th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered at the mountain cabin for a celebration. There were now nearly 20 people present, ranging from newborn babies to Tobias and Katelyn themselves, who were now in their 50s. A long table had been set up outside, and everyone contributed to a feast that lasted for hours. There were speeches and toasts, laughter and tears, and through it all, Tobias kept his arm around Katelyn's shoulders, his touch still making her heart flutter after 3 decades together. That evening, after everyone else had gone to bed or returned to their own cabins, Tobias and Katelyn walked down to the lake one more time. The moon was full and bright, casting silver light across the water. "I have been thinking about that day you came to find me by the creek," Tobias said. "The morning I was leaving to come back up here. Do you remember?" "Of course I remember. How could I forget?" "I was going to leave without saying goodbye. I thought it would be easier that way for both of us. But then I looked up and you were there, and I knew I could not do it. I knew that leaving you would be the biggest mistake of my life." "I could not let you go without telling you how I felt," Katelyn said. "It was terrifying, but I knew I had to do it." "And then you kissed me." He smiled at the memory. "I had not kissed a woman in 31 years, and suddenly there you were, brave and beautiful, and offering me something I thought I had lost forever. In that moment, my whole life changed. Mine too." He pulled the familiar envelope from his pocket, his nightly ritual unchanged by 3 decades. "I made you a promise that morning. I said I would write you every day, even though I had not written a letter in 30 years. And I have kept that promise. Every single day for 30 years, I have written to tell you what is in my heart." "You have," she agreed, her voice thick with emotion, "and I have saved everyone. All these boxes full of letters, a record of our love." "I want to keep writing them," he said, "for however many days we have left. It is my way of making sure you know every single day how much you are loved." "I already know," she said softly, "but I never want you to stop." They kissed in the moonlight, these two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that exceeded their wildest dreams. Around them, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, but within the circle of their love, everything was vibrant and alive. The final years of their lives were peaceful. They grew old together in their mountain cabin, surrounded by family and the wilderness they both loved. Tobias continued to write his daily letters, though his handwriting grew shakier with age. Katelyn continued to read everyone, treasuring them as she always had. When Tobias passed away at the age of 75, it was peacefully in his sleep, with Katelyn beside him. She found a letter on his nightstand that he had written the evening before, and through her tears she read his final words to her. "My beloved Katelyn," it said, "if you are reading this, then my time has come. Do not grieve too long, my love. We had a beautiful life together, more than I ever deserved or hoped for. You took a lonely mountain man and gave him a reason to live, a reason to love, a reason to write. Every letter I wrote you was a small piece of my heart, and now you have it all. Thank you for 32 years of joy. Thank you for our children and grandchildren. Thank you for being the light in my darkness. I will love you in death as I loved you in life, completely, eternally, without reservation. Wait for me on the other side, and we will walk these mountains together again. All my love, always and forever, Tobias." Katelyn lived for another 6 years after Tobias's death, staying in their mountain cabin and watching their family grow. She reread his letters often, finding comfort in his words and in the memories they held. She told her grandchildren stories about the mountain man who had not written a letter in 30 years until he fell in love, and how that love had transformed both of their lives. When Katelyn's time finally came, she died peacefully in the cabin she had shared with Tobias, surrounded by their children and grandchildren. In her hand was the first letter Tobias had ever written to her, the one that had arrived just days after that kiss by the creek. And in her heart was the certainty that she would see him again, that their love was strong enough to transcend even death. The family buried Katelyn next to Tobias on a hillside overlooking the lake, marking their graves with simple stones carved with their names and the dates of their long lives. But the true monument to their love was not carved in stone. It was contained in the dozens of boxes full of letters that Katelyn had saved, more than 10,000 letters written over 32 years, each one a testament to a love that had begun with a single kiss and lasted a lifetime. Catherine inherited the letters and kept them safe, eventually donating them to a historical society where they became part of the permanent collection, a record of life and love in the Wild West. Scholars studied them for insights into frontier life, but what struck every reader was the simple, profound love that infused every page. Here was a man who had learned to open his heart again after decades of self-imposed isolation, and a woman who had been brave enough to take a chance on him. Together, they had built something beautiful and lasting. Their descendants continued to gather at the mountain cabin every summer, keeping the tradition alive. The cabin itself was maintained lovingly, a shrine to Tobias and Katelyn and the love story that had begun there. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the moon was full and bright, people swore they could see two figures walking hand in hand down by the lake, forever together in the mountains they both loved. The legacy of Tobias and Katelyn Yates lived on not just in their children and grandchildren, but in the example they had set. They had shown that it was never too late to open your heart to love, that even the longest loneliness could be healed by the right person. They had proven that love did not have to be loud or flashy to be profound, that sometimes the deepest love was expressed in the quiet, daily commitment to showing up and saying, "I love you," especially when that person was right beside you. Thomas's sons became guides and trappers like their father, carrying on the family tradition. Catherine's daughters became artists, their paintings of the mountains hanging in galleries across the country. Matthew's children became explorers and adventurers, always seeking new horizons but always coming home to the mountains eventually. And all of them carried with them the story of their grandparents, the mountain man who wrote letters every day, and the brave schoolteacher who had kissed him by a creek one spring morning and changed both their lives forever. Years became decades, and decades became a century. The Wild West changed, modernized, lost much of its frontier character. But in the mountains of Wyoming, the cabin still stood, and the story of Tobias and Katelyn still inspired those who heard it. It became a local legend, the tale of the mountain man who had lived alone for 30 years until love taught him to write again, and the teacher who had traveled across the country to find her destiny in a rough frontier town. The letters themselves, preserved in climate-controlled archives, continued to draw visitors. Couples would come to read them, finding inspiration for their own relationships. Scholars wrote dissertations analyzing them. But perhaps the most frequent visitors were those who had lost hope in love, who felt that their chance had passed them by. They would read Tobias's words, simple, honest, heartfelt, and Katelyn's responses, equally genuine, and they would leave believing once again that love was possible, that it was never too late, that somewhere out there was a person who would see them and choose them and commit to them every single day. In this way, Tobias and Katelyn's love story became immortal. It transcended their individual lives and became something larger, a beacon of hope and possibility. They had lived ordinary lives in extraordinary times, working hard, raising their family, loving each other through joy and sorrow. But in that ordinariness was something profoundly beautiful, a reminder that the greatest adventures are not always about conquering new territories or achieving fame and fortune. Sometimes the greatest adventure is simply opening your heart to another person and saying yes to a future together. The mountain man had not written a letter in 30 years, but after one kiss, he wrote to his beloved every day for the rest of his life. And in doing so, he created a legacy of love that would endure long after both he and his Katelyn had returned to the earth they loved. Their story became part of the landscape itself, woven into the fabric of the mountains and the Wild West, a testament to the transforming power of love and the courage it takes to reach for happiness even when you have convinced yourself it is no longer possible. In the end, that was the true lesson of their lives, that love can find you anywhere, even in the loneliest places. That it is never too late to change, to open yourself to another person, to build something beautiful from the ruins of past pain. that the simplest gestures, a daily letter, a tender word, a gentle touch can become the foundation of a love that lasts not just a lifetime, but for generations beyond. Tobias and Katelyn proved that true love is not about grand romantic gestures, but about showing up day after day and choosing each other. And in a world that often felt harsh and unforgiving, their story reminded people that tenderness and devotion still mattered, that they would always matter, that they were perhaps the only things that truly did matter in the end.